Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Tom Banchoff. I am a professor at Georgetown University, and I guess I can say welcome to Georgetown University because this is our Villa La Balza here in Florence, and it's my first visit, and many of us are here from campus, and we want to first recognize the tremendous hospitality of Alan Earhart and his team. There are lots of wonderful activities that go on here throughout the year, including gatherings like this, academic gatherings, presentation of work in progress, and so on. I have a couple of other roles at the university. One is I direct our Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, which is sponsoring a multi-year project that we're here to continue and engage in this afternoon on the Jesuits and globalization. And I'll introduce my colleague Jose Casanova in a minute, who is leading the project for the center. It's, as I say, a multi-year interdisciplinary project really focused on the intersection of the Jesuit order with globalization historically and in the present day. And what we've done is convened a group of scholars. This is our third meeting. We had a meeting at Georgetown, a meeting at Oxford, and we're here for our third meeting. The first two topics that we focused on were mission and dialogue and education in the human person, and our topic today is justice and the common good. As you can see, three themes that resonate with the Jesuit and Catholic tradition as it's evolved historically, but three themes that are also very topical in wider conversations about globalization today. So the idea is to explore how Jesuits have played a role in the process of globalization, how globalization has impacted the Jesuit order and the role of the Catholic Church worldwide, but also, as Jose will develop in his remarks, to challenge some of the dominant approaches to the study of globalization with the Jesuit experience as a background. So what I'd like to do is briefly introduce our speakers. This is going to be a very informal discussion. We'll first hear from Jose Casanova, my colleague at the Berkeley Center and a sociologist of religion at Georgetown, and then we'll hear from two participants in the project. First from Sabina Pavone from Macerata University here in Italy, and David Hollenbach of the Society of Jesus, who is at Boston College and is spending a year at Georgetown. They'll present different aspects of the project with a focus on this third theme of justice and the common good. And then we're delighted to welcome three discussants from the area. We'll hear first from Wei Jiang, who is visiting from King's College London, and then from two colleagues based at the European University Institute, Katharina Kufner and Olivier Roy. Everyone will speak for 5 to 10 minutes, which should leave plenty of time for conversation. And then we'll be able to close and move to a beautiful reception here with this tremendous view of the city. So thanks for being here, and with that, I turn it over to Jose.
Well, this is one of these occasions in which the panel is larger than the audience.
That's not true.
Almost. And of course, we are talking to half of the people involved in the project, so really, we want to present the project to those of you who are, yes, for the first time learning about the project, but also for ourselves to remind ourselves what we are doing. So it will be good to have this opportunity. Maybe the background. The idea is simply to the striking fact that the Jesuits were, in the early modern phase of globalization, were pioneers, right? Established in 1540, I mean, they established themselves as companions at the University of Paris before, in the 30s, but they got the official recognition from the Pope in 1540. But already 1 year before, in 39, Frank Xavier, one of the first companions, was sent to India by the King of Portugal. So there is this connection already from the very beginning between the Iberian colonial global expansion and the Society of Jesus. They were established really as a missionary order. Primarily, this is very clear in their original idea, and because of that, they were not sure where they should go, and they thought, well, let the Pope tell us where we should go to spread the gospel and to help souls. The idea of to help souls is kind of the key generative impulse of both Ignatius and the Society of Jesus. And they thought of being mobile to go anywhere, everywhere, where they were needed the most. Originally, they thought they would go to Jerusalem. When they couldn't realize this dream or this idea, then decided to be open. And so they decided to go everywhere. And you see in their first foundation, were ready to go anywhere where there were schismatics, heretics, infidels, to the Indies, anywhere. And so a few decades after their establishment, they were indeed everywhere, all over Latin America, in Goa, in Malacca, in the Moluccas, in Ethiopia, in Congo, in Africa, in Japan, in China. The first treaty between China and Russia, establishing the territorial boundaries between two empires, was written in Nerchinsk. In Latin, I mean, the two signed documents were written in Latin by the Jesuits because they had relations with both courts, the court of Beijing and the court of China. So they were, if you wish, the first global non-government organization before there were global transnational structures. And so they got into a lot of tension. They played this, I would argue, interstitial role between the different nation states in Europe at the time when the nation state, the Westphalian system, was being established. So they were looked suspiciously by everybody. Everybody tried to use them because they appeared to be a very good group of people to help everybody in whatever they wanted to do, whether it was education, whether it was to organize their kingdoms, to organize their subjects, to discipline their subjects. But they thought they were too papists for the nationals, too Spanish. The Spaniards didn't trust them. And so it was this, everybody wanted to use them. They were useful for everybody, but they were autonomous and independent from everybody. And so at the moment of this establishment of the Westphalian system, both the territorial structure of the nation state in Europe and then the colonial territorial expansion of the Westphalian system over the globe, they were really key figures in these dynamics, where dynamic conflicts between nations, the religious wars, and the whole process of the counter-reformation in Europe, or precisely the colonial expansion, the Portuguese, the Iberian colonial expansion, all over Latin America, all over Asia. And so they were, if you wish, globalizers before the present age of globalization. And there is something about their idea of what a global structure should look before European hegemony that has some structural similarities with our now entering new global age after European hegemony. So I think there is something to be learned from the way in which they dealt with crucial issues of interreligious encounter, of religious pluralism, and they found a way through a form of Christian universalism that could go with cultural relativism. And so this allowed them to have an extremely open, so they went as Christians to make everybody Christian, but not to make everybody European. So even Acosta said that you don't need to Hispanize the Indians to reach the gospel, you don't need to Portugalize the Chinese, what you need is to Christianize them. So they have a notion of this Christian universalism that was not tied to any particular European Roman culture. And this made them a very interesting, the whole process of inculturation, global and local simultaneously, universal in particular. And so in our age that we are dealing with these issues, the philosophers are dealing with these issues, what is universal rights, what is inculturation, how can we have multiple modernities, the kind of issues we are now struggling with, philosophers, social scientists, theories of globalization, were issues very close to the issues they encountered at the time. So the idea is to have in this project, as Stan Banchov said, around these three topics of interreligious dialogue and global mission, around education, formation of the person, disciplining, whatever you want to call it, spiritual exercises, and how they are related, and the final about social justice and the common good, how they were meddling in politics all the time from the beginning, and so how they were Stato in l'Estato, a state within the state, and how they had an imperial project of global hegemony. Those were the three accusations. And now they are again meddling in politics at the margins, the peripheries in interesting ways again. I mean, you see how a Jesuit reaching the Vatican, becoming the Pope, and how he's meddling in politics in a very interesting way again. And so The idea is that we will be hearing when we decided to have this project, we thought that it should be a very clearly interdisciplinary project, bringing historians, both historians of the early modernity, so we have young historians like Sabina Pavone and Alyosha Moldavsky, who bring the newest kind of scholarship on early modernity and colonial history and global history. We have 19th century historians. We have, of course, the Dean of Jesuit History and the Dean Jesuit historian simultaneously to be in the project to help us not to make two terrible mistakes. And then we have five historians, 5 theologians, basically people working on issues within the Jesuit order, dealing with issues with 3 of them themselves key figures today in the contemporary society, dealing one, Dan Madigan, with the Muslim-Christian dialogue, has been working in dialogue with Islam for many years. Anthony Utscherler, a great young historian of East Asia, dealing also with the intercultural encounter with Japanese and Chinese history and culture. And Franz Clooney, dealing with the dialogue with the religions of India. And then we have 2 additional theologians, Philip Endean, who has been working on the whole issue of the spiritual exercises and the spirituality of the Jesuits for a long time, a theologian himself, and David Hollenbach, who is one of the key figures in dealing with the whole issue of the aggiornamento of the Jesuits and the Vatican II Council, the Church, and issues of human rights. And again, views Dignitatis Humanae Nostra, and how the Jesuit order has assumed again a global role of more of accommodation, but in a way of assisting, accompanying, helping, and being also interlocutors and representatives of refugees, displaced persons, the people really on the marginal peripheries of globalization. So with this, I will give the floor to the 2 historians, theologians, that will tell us about the old Jesuits and the young Jesuits.
Thank you to Jose. First of all, I want to thank you, Jose Casanova and Tom Benchoff, for having joined me to this project. That was a really very interesting situation to cross our different disciplinaries and ideas about the Society of Jesus and what can be done for the future also of the society. I try to cut my paper, and that it's called Anti-Jesuitism in the Modern Age, Local and Global Dimensions. The Society of Jesus was a controversial religious order from its origin, mostly because it was perceived by the states as the armed branch of the Pope, but also because of its political involvement. From 1540 to 1773, the Jesuits were expelled and banished not only from European states such as France, Venice, England, Russia, but also from missionary contexts such as Brazil and Japan and other peripheral contexts. The aim of my paper is to analyze the phenomenon of anti-Jesuitism in a global and long-lasting perspective. The main purpose is to show how anti-Jesuitism is strictly connected with 2 different ways of perceiving Jesuits as transnationals. First of all, they were perceived by the states as the armed branch of the Pope. Secondly, the missionary strategies adopted by the Jesuits was considered independent from that of propaganda fide, and perceived as potentially dangerous not only by the states but also by the Roman Curia. Speaking about this project, Jose Casanova wrote that, I quote, "Historically, Jesuits lost the battle within the Church and within the wider world. Critics within the Church accused the Jesuits of using cunning strategies of relativist accommodation that compromised the universality of Christianity. The Eurocentric perspective prevailed within the Church. Externally, the transnational papal order lost the battle against the triumphant Westphalian model of sovereign territorial states." End quote. I agree with these words, and it's certainly true that the Society of Jesus lost the battle also because the best of her missionary strategies was not accepted by the Roman Church. In this sense, the rights controversy is a turning point also for anti-Jesuitism. Each kind of anti-Jesuitism has to be studied in interaction with the events. From the origins, in fact, it was connected with different contexts both in Europe, both in New World and in Asia. The establishment of the Society of Jesus, authorized by Pope III, provoked considerable dissension within the Roman Curia, in part because of the old heresy trials against its founder. The innovations Loyola introduced in the practices of the new order, such as the abolition of color singing or a distinctive mode of dress for members of the religious family, stirred serious doubts and caused the society to be perceived as a hermaphrodite order, as Etienne Pasquier scathingly defined it in his Catechisme des Jesuits in 1602. It was neither secular nor regular. An entire circle within the Curia viewed Ignatius and his companions with suspicion because they rejected the traditional occupation of the religious orders. In his letters, Ignatius wrote that every time Jesuits tried to work inside the society, they were perceived as, I quote, "we want to rule the world." This was the origins of an anti-Jesuitism inside the Roman Curia that will explode, as I said, during the rights controversy. The Jesuits have always been caught between national and transnational dynamics, and this is true also for a phenomenon of anti-Jesuitism. The myth of the conspiring, power-hungry Jesuits are also other origins. First among them is the difficulty of understanding the practice of adapting other cultures, the accomodarsi a tutti, as Polanco calls it, which was invariably looked upon with suspicion by critics of the Jesuits. If it is inarguable that the strategy adopted by the Jesuits caused the society's fame to spread, it is also true that the sense of inner logic of that diffusion was not necessarily well understood. In many cases, the adaptive spirit of the Jesuits was mistaken for a kind of deliberate camouflage. It seems, in this light, nothing but another indicator of their fundamentally hypocritical character, if not an outright means of plotting to damage or overthrow the state, to build a universal Jesuit empire. In my paper, I consider here four different categories of anti-Jesuitism. I call the first political religious anti-Jesuitism, and it works above all in Europe. Here, the transnational identity of the Society of Jesus was seen both in Catholic and Protestant contexts as the stoutest supporters of the Pope's temporal power and of the consequent insertion of the Holy See into the internal politics of the nation-states. To do just some examples, in England, Jesuits were considered traitors, and the Parliament Act asserted that, I quote, "not only did the Jesuits deny the spiritual authority of the Queen, but also they recognized the authority of a foreign prince, the Pope, engaged in conspiracy against her." In France, the Jesuits were involved in Catholic leagues during the religious wars and accused to be Spanish agents. In March of 1594, an instruction by Claudia Paviva sent to the French Jesuits avoid them any oath of allegiance to Henry as long as he was under sentence of excommunication out of deference to the Holy See. In December, an attempt upon the king's life by Jean Chastel, an ancient student of the Jesuit College of Clermont, drove the Parliament of Paris to expel the Jesuits. Henry IV, as other sovereigns, feared interference of the Jesuits in the politics of the state, but some years later, he considered that it would be better having Jesuits among his friends rather than among his foes. The strategy was that of linking more strictly the Society of Jesus to the state. In this perspective, also the king's confessor should have to be a Jesuit one. After the murder of Henry IV by Ravaillac, once again Jesuits were accused to promote tyrannicide theory, to build a state inside the state, to be spies of Spain, agents of the Pope, trying to abolish the privileges of the Gallican Church, introduce the Roman Inquisition, and the reception of the Trent decrees in France. In addition, the Society of Jesus had chosen the sort of apostolate that led the Jesuits not to live on the margins, but in close contact with society and power, and all along the 17th century, it was perceived in Europe as a secret society, and the nectar of the Jesuits' Marian congregations played in this sense an ambivalent role, either in reality or in literature. In a few words, we can say that the Society of Jesus' overexposures harmed herself. Such visibility made the society an easy target in an age when denunciatory pamphlet, even when not openly defamatory, rankled feelings in all of Europe. Such pamphlets became excellent means to inflame public opinion. They conditioned political and religious decisions. First, emphasizing the negative traits of simulation in the stereotypes of the society's religious origin. The simulation was deemed to be hypocrisy. The Jesuits seemed to lead their lives guided only by that principle. It was not by chance that the text that stressed simulation had wide circulation. On the other hand, we need also to point out that sometimes Jesuits were much more national-oriented inside the states than anti-Jesuitism showed. Furthermore, the Jesuits were strongly criticized not only by the states, but also by other religious orders and episcopal hierarchy. This is the first category. I call the second category internal or Jesuit anti-Jesuitism, produced most of the times by the unequal relation between Jesuits who had done the Fourth War and those who couldn't reach the status of professed. As John O'Malley wrote, the elitism within the brotherhood that this distinction codified provoked confusion and psychological toll. End of quote. The best example of this kind of anti-Jesuitism is certainly the Monita Secreta Societatis Jesu, written by the Jesuit ex-Jesuit Hieronym Zaporowski and published in Krakow in 1614. But we have also the pamphlet written by the ex-Jesuit, the Italian Giulio Clemente Scotti, and his friend Melchior Inkofer, an Hungarian Jesuit who didn't leave the society, such as many other memorialists who wrote manuscripts against their religious order and particularly against its hierarchical government. For the third category, I chose a global perspective looking particularly to the category of anti-Jesuitism produced by the rights controversy. As I told, I think that this is a turning point in the history of the ancient Society of Jesus, because it was between the middle of the 17th century and the middle of the 18th that the transnational perspective of the Society of Jesus collided both with the Westphalian system of nation-state, above all with the colonialist side of the Westphalian system, and with the Roman Church. Echoes of the right controversy gave life to a huge series of pamphlets both in Europe and in the East that can be considered in an anti-Jesuitist perspective. In colonial contexts, we see ambiguous and overlapping loyalties to various authorities and jurisdiction that gives much more anti-Jesuitism in this context. In the Portuguese Empire, Jesuits had problems also in Brazil during the 17th century, when they were involved into the problem of the indigenous freedom. I cut on this part because it is a bit too long, but it's important to say that in 1661, the fathers were accused to be defenders of the indigenous people and banished from their days. The expulsion was justified, saying that Jesuits spread badly the faith and gave little attention to the indigenous legislation. The crisis in Brazil lasted all along the 17th century, and during the Pombal's persecutions against the Jesuits of the Maranhão, that persecution that was very hard, all the defamatory pamphlets produced against Jesuits and the area in the 17th century were used also in Portuguese expulsion from South America. All these Jesuits expulsion from European, Asian and American countries are useful to understand in which way the Society of Jesus contracted time by time her role in the so-called Westphalian system of nation-state during the 17th and the 18th century. In this perspective, also the Guarani Rebellion is certainly expression of the indigenous section as suggested recently by Guillermo Wilde, but it is also comprehensible as the epilogue of a political, religious and economical contrast between different views of seeing the indigenous colonization. In this period, Rome was not really interested to save the reduction, almost because the Society of Jesus was perceived as potentially dangerous by an important faction of the Roman Curia. The missionary strategy adopted by the Jesuits was independent from that of propaganda fide, and the heraldry in China, such as in India, showed very well critics within the Church accused the Jesuits of using a Canaan strategy of relativist accommodation that compromised the universalism of Christianity. The Eurocentric perspective prevailed within the Church, and the best of the Jesuit transnational way of proceeding was not accepted by the Roman Court. The fourth category, and the last one, of anti-Jesuitism is maybe the best known for the big public. It concerned the second half of the 18th century, when the objective was not just to lash out at the Society of Jesus, but also to attack the complex ideology of the Counter-Reformation. That ideology has had as one of its cardinal points the essential subordination of lay power to ecclesiastical power. It was not that the Jesuits were the only ones who had such a position within the Catholic Church, but they were the most visible since they had embraced the profound integration with the society of their time. For that reason, they became the target of all those who were resolved to defend the prerogatives of the state in the face of the Church. Jesuits were much more perceived as uncomfortable and irritating, if not outright dangerous transnational agents or global Catholic agents, in a way that explains their expulsion from Catholic territories by Catholic monarchies and the final suppression by the Pope. In this period, Jesuits and their enemies, such as Jansenists, adopted the same communication strategies, and in which they kept mirroring one another. There was a Jesuit plot versus a Jansenist plot. And the important overlapping and exchange of roles gave witness to how the modern outstrips the object to which it was applied. Jose Casanova, in his introduction, speaks about also the anti-Semitism in 18th and 19th and then 20th century. It is a paradox that the Jesuits survived after 1773 in Orthodox Russia and Protestant United States, the two countries which were to be the carriers of geopolitical globalization beyond the Westphalian system in the 20th century. Thank you.
Thank you. My paper for this project is more on the contemporary scene, looking at the Jesuits and globalization at and since the Second Vatican Council. I would say just a couple of words, though, about the background and the roots of what I think the more contemporary development has been. And I would highlight just an important phrase that is used by Ignatius Loyola in the constitutions of the Society of Jesus a number of times. Well, at one point, he makes a variation on Aristotle. Aristotle says in the Politics that the good of the polis is more divine than the good of the individual citizen. Ignatius takes that and he says, the more universal the good, the more divine it is. So this strong emphasis on universality, which I think is very much from the very beginning of the Jesuit order, is at the root in some way, I think, in the spirituality of Jesuits, of the global vision that is being pursued. Now, we could go through the history of up till the Vatican Council, and it's a very complex history, and we have a number of papers about this, and Sabina's paper is one, but there are a number of others that give some of the background on this. My paper, though, is looking at around the time of the Second Vatican Council, 1962 to 65, and since then. I make the point in that several Jesuits played very important roles in shaping the agenda of the Second Vatican Council. And then the Council itself had a very important impact on the Jesuits themselves. So it was a kind of two-way street. Two Jesuits, and three Jesuits in particular, but two that I highlight in my paper, Karl Rahner, German theologian, and John Courtney Murray, who was a mentor of mine, an American Jesuit who was the principal author of the Second Vatican Council's Declaration on Religious Freedom. He was the principal consultant in helping to draft that document. These two people had a very significant role to play at the Second Vatican Council. Now, one of the things that's interesting about Rahner it seems to me, is that his theology was one of the sources of a statement made by the council that the church, the Catholic Church, should be, this is a quote, a sign and instrument of intimate union with God and of the unity of the whole human race. The unity of the whole human race is a vision, I think, that echoes this phrase from the council of the union with God and the unity of the human race echoes the Jesuit commitment to the promotion of the glory of God and the common good, a phrase which appears repeatedly again in the writings of Ignatius Loyola. Now, Rahner, I think, is one of the sources of that phrase being in the council, and it was a very important phrase in the conciliar impetus, the renewal of the church. It led Rahner to say that at the Second Vatican Council, for the first time, the Roman Catholic Church became what he called a truly world church, rather than a European church with missionary outposts. Rahner went on in a number of his other essays after the council, and one that he wrote right before he died on what he called European theology, and he was telling European theologians, recognize that you're no longer running the show. He said that that Christian theologians have to become recognizing that they can no longer presume that their theology is rooted in a kind of European Christendom, Greco-Roman civilization, but it has to take into account the larger realities of cultures and civilizations around the world. In particular, he said that Christian theology must come to grips with the fact that it has to deal with understandings of the human grounded in realities such as the transmigration of the souls and the importance of the Islamic Ummah, how to deal with these as religious and theological challenges, not simply the Greco-Roman background that was traditionally shaping much Catholic thought. That's one element, I think, that I wanted to highlight of the Jesuit contribution on this universalism. Second, John Courtney Murray, the American Jesuit who played such an important role in helping to draft the Declaration on Religious Freedom. I could go into great length about the struggles with this drafting and the document, and Murray himself having been facing silencing by the Vatican for a part of his life, and it was a great struggle, but it was a major breakthrough when the Vatican Council defined unambiguous support for the right to religious freedom for the Roman Catholic Church. Indeed, it was a significant force because it changed the agenda, if you will, of the movement of Roman Catholicism in very significant ways. Samuel Huntington has an interesting perspective on this, a political scientist who died a few years ago from Harvard, has argued that there have been three waves of democratization in modern history. One would be the French and American revolutions in the 18th century. The second wave being immediately after the Second World War, where the Axis powers of Germany, Japan, and Italy became democratic. And the third wave, Huntington talks about, occurring from about the mid-1960s on into the present, when he was writing in the early 90s. And he argues that that third wave, the countries that transitioned from authoritarian regimes to democratic regimes during that period, 2/3 of them were Catholic societies with Catholic cultures, starting with Portugal and Spain, spreading to Latin America, expanding to places like Korea and the Philippines, and ultimately Poland and what happened finally with the Soviet Union. And Huntington says the single most important cause of that transition was the influence of the Declaration on Religious Freedom from the Second Vatican Council. Pretty significant claim to make that kind of move. But in any case, whether it's totally justifiable as a total generalization, it clearly had an influence in this direction. So I would highlight that as another dimension. If we're going to see the dialogue between Christianity and non-Christian religions, this emphasis on the freedom of religion for everyone is an extraordinarily important contribution to that direction, and I would say that Mary had an important role to play in that. Then, since the Council, the Second Vatican Council had an important influence on the Jesuit order. One thing that it did was it led to the consideration at the 32nd General Congregation of the Jesuits of what its mission should be in the post-conciliar era. And it made a very fundamental commitment to saying at the congregation, which took place in 67, 68, that the Society of Jesus' mission is deeply connected with the advancement of Christian faith and the promotion of justice in the world. This commitment to the promotion of justice has become a very central reality in the Jesuit operation since then. Two people that I would highlight just as symbols of this movement. One is a man whom I had the opportunity to work with on several occasions on human rights issues, Ignacio Echeverria, who was the president of the University of Central America in San Salvador, who was deeply committed to this advancement of the Jesuit promotion. A second is a person who Angélbert Mveng, a Cameroonian Jesuit, who was an artist, an anthropologist, and pursued, his frescoes are on the walls of the Jesuit chapel in Nairobi today at Hekima College, and he is a person with deep commitment to the promotion of the Church's role in Africa, to taking African culture seriously and especially responding to the needs of the poor in Africa. I highlight these two men because both of them were assassinated because of their commitments. Ignacio Echeverria, as the president of the University of Central America in San Salvador, assassinated by the military of the Salvadoran government, and Angélbert Mveng, clearly assassinated by death squads connected with the political and economic elite of Cameroon. This is a very important impact, showing that this is not something that is cost-free, these commitments. I would finally just highlight, I think, some ways that in addition to this commitment to justice, since the Second Vatican Council, the Jesuit order has, you could say discovered, but I would say rediscovered, the deep commitment to the interreligious dialogue dimensions of its mission. We know from some of the work of Anthony Ursuler and some of the others in this project about the encounter with of people like Ricci and De Nobili and Valignano and so forth, and their commitments in the early Jesuit days of dialogue with non-Christian religions. This has become a very important commitment in the Jesuit order today, and the 34th General Congregation of the Jesuit order made a major commitment to interreligious dialogue. I would think that that's one of the reasons why we hear Pope Francis these days talking repeatedly about the importance of dialogue. He talks about that regularly as a major commitment of the church today. The church should be what he calls a listening church, a church that takes. He says, this is a quote from Pope Francis. He says, we have to follow the art of accompaniment in engaging with those who are not Christians. And he said this means we should remove our sandals before the sacred ground of the other. This is rather remarkable language coming from the Pope. But I think, again, one can see some influence of some of this Jesuit tradition in the background. So that's an overview of some of my contribution to this project.
Well, thank you, Sabina. And David, I think you've given us all, especially those of you who are new to the project, a sense of the ambition and scale of what we're doing, with some historical perspectives, some contemporary perspectives, a wide range of themes. One reason we love to have these gatherings as we move toward papers, chapters, and a volume is to bring in other voices, to provide an outside perspective, maybe a critical perspective, some helpful insights as we move forward with the project, and we're delighted that 3 colleagues have joined us. And we'll start off with Wei Zhang, who has some comments.
I should thank first Gagarina and Christina for inviting me to this conference, this meeting, and also thank 2 presenters in the panel for their fascinating talks and topics. I have the honor of reading the drafts before coming to the panel, and I would like to limit my comments on Dr. Bavone's paper because I'm not an expert on modern history. 5 years ago, when I started my PhD in King's College London, a project on the Catholic missionaries in the Far East, 16th, 17th centuries. When I went to Rome for the archival work, the first book I saw in the archive of Jesuits, Arsi, is the book by Dr. Bavone. And her book is very helpful for me to understand how the religious rivalry, missionary rivalry in Asia had their roots in the European context. And in today's paper, Dr. Bavone gave a category of the anti-Jesuitism, and she briefly divided into 4 types. The first type is the political religious context in Europe, and 2 cases are England and Spain. And the second category is the complexity of the first generation and second generations in the missions, overseas missions in Asia and in Americas. And the third category is probably the most influential historical event of the Chinese rights controversy and the Malabar rights controversy in the Asian context. And the fourth category is the second half of the 18th century, when the Society of the Jesuits was suppressed. And the very concept of anti-Jesuitism is fascinating. And since I'm working not only on the Jesuit missionaries in China, but also other religious orders in China, this becomes more interesting because, as far as I know, almost each religious order had their controversial history. We know about anti-Franciscanism, and also within the Dominican order, other constant conflicts about their disciplines. So I would ask Dr. Bavone, how do you make this, how do you contextualize anti-Jesuitism in this ecclesiastical nature of the religious orders? And also the second comment of mine is about the reflection on this concept. Is it because Society of Jesuits was surprised in 1773 that we have to go back to the beginning to portray the Jesuits as a victim? And is this of teleology? That we try to portray the Jesuit as a victim because it was surprised eventually. So that is maybe a brave question on this concept.
Thank you. We'll have a chance to come back to those 2 questions in the discussion. Now we'll hear from Katarina.
Thank you for having me here today. The reason why I'm here, I think, is because I happen to study in a villa somehow like this close by, so I'm a neighbor, and because there happens to be the word Jesuit in my PhD project to explain the coincidence. My project consists in rewriting a book a natural history of the Chaco in Argentina that was written in 1789 by an ex-Jesuit, ex-missionary of that area. And he wrote that book in exile in Faenza, close to Florence. So I will write this book on the natural history of the province of Chaco again today. That is my project. This is a project of history of historiography, so I'm interested in historical changes in the epistemology of history writing at the end of the 18th century. My question in general, and in particular with regard to my empirical object, which is this book, is what is history subjectively for someone who writes history objectively? So this is more or less the perspective from which I currently look at things, at everything. What is the historical perspective in a book? How does a book use historical perspectives? And this is also the perspective from which I tried to read your book, or the material that I kindly received for this meeting here. It did not include all the articles, but just a selection, so that this might explain my selective perception. So, with regard to the overall structure of the book, concluding more or less from the table of contents and from what I read, what is the use of the historical perspective in this book? First of all, I perceive it as a book that is not framed as a study that consequently tries to historicize something. It is, concluding from what I read in your project presentation in the internet, a book that should provide normative guidance. So, to quote from your flyer, the questions that you ask as the core questions are: how can we improve understanding across the world's great religious and cultural traditions? How can we educate students for citizenship and leadership in a globalizing world? And how can we build more just and more effective global governance? So this book, in my eyes, is written for someone who, for example, is running a university, maybe even a Jesuit university. For someone or an institution that has a historical identity, that looks back at his or her own roots for guidance, that tries to deduct guiding principle for the future from this past. I think that this objective more or less defines the basic structure of this book. So, the three chapters that there are. The first chapter, the historical identity, there was the world in the process of globalization, and there were the Jesuits as actors. The second chapter is the core objective, education as the core objective in the past and the present. And the third chapter, an attempt to identify guiding normative principles for the present and the future, for analysis and activity. So this is where the common good, justice and peace comes in. Now, I think I cannot comment on the question if this structure works, if it's useful, if it's logical, because this question can only be answered by those who are addressed by this book. And since I'm not leading a university of any kind, nor am I a global governor, nor a Jesuit, nor a leader, maybe not even a citizen, I cannot comment on this. But I can observe, and this is what I'll try to do, if and how a historicizing perspective is at work in this book. So, again, to the overall structure, what is the historicizing perspective in the overall structure of the book? Again, there is the first chapter, there is the world, the process of the world becoming globalized, and the Jesuits as actors in it. The perspective of the four contributions, of the four articles, is historical. They tell us what happened sometime in history. Now, how is this arranged? At first sight, it seems geographically. It would seem that there are the two articles on Asia, then one on Latin America, well, and then an article on the world of Islam with a specific topic. So on second sight, it seems that just Asia and America are geographical terms, but Islam and more the Islam world seems to be more of a theological or religious denominator. So at third sight, I would say, when I take even into account the content of the contributions, that with regard to Asia and the Islam world, these contributions deal with theological questions, and only the article on Latin America actually has a consequent geographical territorial focus. That would be my first observation with regard to the first chapter. Of course, I don't miss Europe in that framework because I'm not Eurocentric. As an Austrian, I'm of course a little bit Austrocentric, so I miss an article on mission and interreligious dialogue between Protestants and Jesuits in Austria of the 16th century. The other two chapters. They are structured around two principles or categories of analysis that you're interested in, today. So education and common good, justice, peace. For each of these two chapters, there is some sort of historical introduction. And then this is followed by more contemporary examples, sort of case studies that follow. For the education chapter, the second one, there is O'Malley's article that proceeds normatively. So the question is more or less, what can we learn from the historical Jesuit education system for the needs of contemporary global multicultural world today? This is the historical introduction. For the common good chapter, the third one, there are two properly historical articles at the beginning, arranged around the traumatic event of Jesuit history, the expulsion, repression, dissolution. So these two articles, from their content, form a sort of a bracket around this trauma. So first, anti-Jesuitism, and second, the Restoration period. If I understood that correctly. That would be my second observation. And this would also be somehow the framework for starting to look at the use of historicization in this book. Now I would like to finish with one observation that goes a little bit more into detail, because there's not more time. There's no time for much more. It regards one specific historical contribution of the volume, the one by Alyosha Moldavsky on Jesuit mission in Latin America. And my observation regards what she says about the term contribution and how to conceptualize history. Because I think there is some sort of a gap, a non-mediation between what she says and what the rest of the book, and between the concept of the rest of the book. So in her article, Moldavsky covers, for the first chapter, the one that talks about the world, more or less geographically Latin America. So her focus is geographic, territorial, historical properly, and not theological, problem-oriented. And I would say that her main point is that historically there is no such thing as a stable Jesuit mission culture. So to quote from her conclusion, quote, "What historians call mission culture was a constantly new context with ever new social interaction and hierarchies." End of quote. So rephrasing that in my words, Jesuit missionaries, as all missionaries, were not just players, but they were also played. By whom? Not just by the indigenous, the others. There is today more or less a post-colonial consensus to point that out. But they were also played by the ruling colonial system, in the sense they are part of a historical economic system that is bigger than their mission, and where they are just one element driven by structural dynamics. This means, for me at least, as I understood this contribution, that the important level of historical analysis in order to understand mission and religious cultural encounter historically is not just the mission culture, but something like why not the colonial capitalist world system. Moldavsky says at the beginning of her article, to quote, "One can only really understand the missionary action of the Society of Jesus in Ibero-America within a larger context, the early modern Iberian expansion in which the Jesuits were participating." And then she continues, and there I come back to this point about contribution and how to write history, the term contribution and how to write history. She continues, "Although much recent scholarly work on the missionary action of the Jesuits in America has been able to get beyond apologetic historiography, it is still to some extent couched in terms of the Jesuit contribution to modernity." as I would add now, maybe the Jesuit contribution to globalization. Then she continues, quote, "This way of thinking history in contribution occludes important questions about how the Jesuits themselves changed, how they were played, how they were part of a system, of a history." So here I will stop, just to come one more time back to to the flyer of your project, where you say about the Jesuits and Globalization project, to quote from this flyer. What is the main objective of the project? Over 3 years, we are convening leading Jesuit and lay scholars to examine the historical contributions of the Jesuits to globalization and the contemporary relevance of the global horizons for the challenges faced by humanity in the 21st century. So here the term contribution appears again 2 more times: the contribution of the Jesuits to global education, the Jesuit contribution to law and human rights. I think that using history in a perspective and a narrative of contribution to globalization prevails throughout the whole book, and I did not find any responses to the critique that I found, or the diverging view that I found in Moldavsky's article. However, as I said, fair enough, your book is not primarily a historicizing study, and my from outside observations are maybe somehow not adequate, but maybe it would be useful for the common good in particular to analyze globalization not just in terms of contributions as something that adds up, but maybe globalization does not add up at all.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your thoughtful analysis. We'll have to put some more thought into these flyers. You know, usually they're not picked apart this way. Very, very helpful. Olivier Roy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I have, first I have to say that I'm very interested in this debate on Jesuits, because my first academic work was on the rights controversy, my master thesis. I have 3 remarks here. The first is on this concept of culture. It's clear that the Greeks input, the Jesuits in the 16th century were precisely to recognize culture as something which does exist and which is relevant for conversion. So once you say, you put that Christianity is a universal religion and is the universal truth, what do you do with culture? No. Either you can ignore culture, or you can fight against cultures, or you can, precisely as they did, try to enter into culture, to put faith into culture. The outcome was not obvious, because we can say that the 16th century was a century where culture were recognized, but the conclusions were not the same. For instance, take Jean de Léry, who was a Protestant, not a missionary, but he was by Lévi-Strauss as the first anthropologist, because he wrote a book about the culture of the local Indians. But he just said also that for saving souls, culture is totally irrelevant, because of predestination. So culture is a nice thing, but we don't care, While for the Jesuits, on the contrary, culture was a tool of conversion, a tool to save souls. And if we take this issue of saving souls, at that time, the Protestants were not missionary, precisely because they believed in predestination. So in this case, it's an offense to God to try to save people. But they became missionaries in the early 19th century, and their attitudes towards culture was totally different. For them, culture was irrelevant. Of course, they learned the languages and things like that. But they didn't care, and now they don't care. Take the evangelicals, when they preach, when they convert, they just don't care about culture, and it works. So my question is, what is the outcome of the Jesuit missionary work now? Does it work? Do you have figures, about conversions? And do they care about converting? Which is another issue. Second point, humanities, and it's linked with that, the great input of the Jesuit educational system was precisely to consider humanities as not only perfectly legitimate, but as almost autonomous. Of course, they did consider that it should go along with faith, but that you could be a good poet, a good writer, without being a good Christian. And they taught humanities as an autonomous field of teaching and so on and so. And of course, for them, humanities was to consider that secularism can have a cultural value that you can learn from the philosophers, even if the philosophers are opposed to religion. But in the process of globalization, what do you do with humanities? What are modern humanities? What do you teach now? Because the content, the corpus of the teaching were largely European humanities, Latin, Greek, and so and so. And how do you conceive now of the universality of the human being in terms of culture and education, in terms of humanities? This very interesting isomorphic is very interesting. How the isomorphism works? Does it mean that, in fact, the European model of humanities and education is spreading? In this kind, we have some sort of a westernization of globalization, or globalization as westernization, or is globalization precisely the end of the corpus of the content, under some sort of McLuhan perception? So, what do we teach now as humanism? And my last remark is by learning about Huntington, it's a professional mistake. I didn't know about that, but now I know. Which is very interesting if we compare with the Arab Spring, the fourth wave of democratization. There is this idea that as long as there is no theological reform, Muslim countries cannot become democratic. So, in a sense, it's very coherent with the Huntingtonian perception of the world. When you have a culture associated with the religion, you can open the culture only if you open the religion, either by secularization or by reformation. So, for him, clearly from the example you mentioned, the Second Council of Vatican is a kind of theological reformation, which has suddenly opened, the political field and so and so. So it's not a critique of Jesuits, it's a critique of Huntington. I think that it's also some sort of a mistake, because what is first, is Second Council of Vatican a consequence is the cause of religious change, or is it the consequence of the religious change? And there is something here which for me is missing, is what I call religiosity. Not the way the theologians do consider the religious corpus, but the way the ordinary believers do behave with religion. How do they take religion in their own hands, And I think that it's more that which did happen in Poland and because in Ireland too. Ireland didn't enter into a democratic process because it was a democracy, but you have the change, inside of the religious culture, if you can say that. And I think that it's what is going on now with the so-called Arab Spring. It's not an issue of theological reformation of Islam. It's an issue of the change of religiosity among the people.
Thank you. Given us a lot to think about. Jose, in the interest of time, should we throw it open to the audience to ask some questions? I know you might want to respond.
Well, I can respond at the end, but I think that it's good to hear.
Let's broaden it. Are there other issues or
maybe
questions?
let's just say the fact that we have such three interesting comments means that there is something in the project interesting, because all three were extremely interesting in terms of the direction in which they went. So that's very good. So it really makes me happy about it. Please.
So are there any questions or comments from the floor? Other angles that people would like to introduce? Things you'd like to respond to, either what you heard from the discussants or from the presenters? We can talk up here, I'm sure, but we'd like to engage.
Maybe
you.
yes, briefly, while you think your questions.
Okay.
Well, I think your questions, because I think this was very interesting, the issue you raised. I mean, I mentioned 5 historians, 5 theologians, but actually I missed to mention 3 social scientists. I'm a sociologist, and really, and I was trained by Marx and Weber, and by Wallerstein, the world system, and the Westphalian system of the state. This is my background as a sociologist, comparative historical sociologist. So, and precisely there is both. It's not a historical book, and it's not a sociological book in this sense. It's an attempt to somehow challenge also both simply historical descriptions of world history from an objective perspective and a sociological construction of models and so on. So it's very much self-reflective from our present today as we are constructing a globe. What is our, I mean, it's not the flyer. The flyer is, I was not the author. This is more but there is a very interesting that you read so boldly, and it's very good that you read so boldly into the structure of the book. Is much more complex than you pointed out, but it's very good. I mean, you made a very, very good analysis. So I just wanted to make this. And there are the other 2, a political scientist, comparativist also, and a political economist. And human development at the end, the final project, the final chapter of the book, right? Yes. Maybe Alyosha, you would like to, because I think this is very interesting that you pick up really, Alyosha is really the historian in the book, since he's the one that is challenging us. This word contribution should not, you are right, it's not the right word, and we should be careful how we use it. This is very important that you pick up this tension in the book, because it's very good, but it's very good that we have really a real historian who has been working through these historiographical self-reflections of what the purpose of history is and what history is not, and so on.
Well, I think you understood very well my point, so I don't have to tell it again tomorrow, because that was one of the points I wanted to discuss with you tomorrow, because it is also in the introduction, and I had some remarks about that, and I think it would be really make the book more complex, and to understand Jesuits' role, if we can still employ this term, as I mean, how Jesuits are incorporated within globalization, how they're using it, how they were incorporating also this process in their ways of proceeding and aims. This is not the same thing as contribution. I mean, it's a bit different. So, because globalization was already going on, and because, for example, if we take the economic thing, which is not exactly our point here, but it's interesting to take it, how Jesuits used trade that was going on, and how it was interesting for them to have this great net.
They were the first multinational corporations and economic corporation as well. I mean, Gorilla Alden has written. They controlled the silk trade in the East for 100 years between Japan and China, and they financed their missions with this.
So, and also with plants, you know that there is a new thing here that has been done some time ago. So I was very interested by your reading, because I think it was exactly something that I think it's interesting to raise. And well, I don't think I have. I mean, we might talk about that more tomorrow. I think it would be interesting to understand your question about teleological. Well, I'm not the most. I'm the best to answer that question. Maybe Sabina, you have more
You mean how,
to say about that.
the question about the suppression?
Yes,
Yeah,
and how it
because there were
shaped our
already
view of
all the suppressions before, Jesuits were suppressed, and so it's not only because there was one big suppression that we are interested in suppressions, because there was also before, much more before, as Sabina told, with the problems about regency. And this is a very important thing in the 16th century about Jesuits, things about thoughts about who should rebel, you know, against the king.
Yeah.
And that is.
So maybe I'll jump in and share a little bit more about the project as it relates to this issue. So one issue is, as you pointed out very nicely, how much are we trying to find a usable history that helps us to understand what's going on today with globalization, with the Jesuit order, and going back and providing a sort of thematic, selective reading of history, whereas your paper is much more grounded in history and historiography. So that's a tension within the project that we're trying to work out. The project is also organized around this suppression in another way. It's come up here in the comments. As most of you may know, this is the bicentennial. It's been 200 years since the Jesuit order was reestablished in 1814. And that's the proximate cause of this project. And our final conference or seminar, will be more of a conference, will be in December at the Gregorian in Rome, not too far from here, as part of a kind of reflection on the part of the order, as well as on the part of scholars, about where we are 200 years afterwards. So this question of the suppression as a pivotal point, and how we read the history before the suppression, because we may have known that the suppression took place, how the theme of anti-Jesuitism, and maybe Sabina, you can speak to this, I think the question was, does it only become real because of that catastrophe, if you like, that struck the Jesuits with the suppression, or does it have some other wider significance beyond that? Can you speak to that question?
Can you repeat maybe the question because
Is our focus on, I think this is what Wei Zhang was saying, that the interest in anti-Jesuitism is provoked by the fact and reflection on the suppression that followed. That it magnifies it in our eyes as a phenomenon.
Well, I don't think that there is a real connection between the real suppression and anti-Jesuitism as a phenomenon, because in that period, as I try to write, there are different positions that are all against the Jesuits. That's true that Jansenist, Illuminists, and so on. But I think that, well, anti-Jesuitism is a phenomenon much more that you have to look in a long-lasting perspective.
Before and after the suppression.
Yes. The suppression is just one moment. It's important in the history of the Society of Jesus, but it's not so important in relation with this.
It's not the sole
I don't
focus.
think so.
David? Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, I found myself when I was reading your paper, the tension between the Society of Jesus and the Westphalian nation state, I understood to be a very significant factor in the anti-Jesuitism that was, and that was something that was not just a result of it was a tension that was there well before the dynamics of the suppression. It was one of the reasons that led to the conflict that caused the suppression of the Jesuits. But it's a bigger issue, and it raises a theoretical question about the relationship of any kind of universalist organization and the nation-state system. That raised some very interesting questions.
And yet they were confessors in Madrid, in Paris, in Vienna, and in Munich
I know.
at the very time. So they were in the interest. They were at the same time in the core of the Westphalian system. So this makes it interesting. They are never. We cannot. It's true. There was always bigger history in the Jesuits. They are never the ones driving history. But the fact that they were suppressed so frequently, the fact that they are such a problem for everybody at the same time, however, they are so much at the center of things. So it is these paradoxes that we want to analyze in a way which are interesting. And the question you raised about humanity, because I mean, there is a more paper that addresses this issue, the paper by Clooney, who is not historical at all. It's a purely theological analysis of text and how the same from Frank Xavier through Balignano, through Ricci, through Nobili, the same argument against the transmigration of souls and rebirth, but not on theological grounds, but simply using philosophical grounds. So it is natural philosophy against a theological belief of Asia, but not against a Christian belief. So the notion that somehow the Christian beliefs go with universal philosophical reason and humanity is so strong to them, they could not understand there may be a possibility of other forms of imagining humanity, let's say, within Asia. And this is why these projects also link to the rebirth of multiple modernities, linked to the axial age and the different visions of humanity that emerge out of Greek and Hebrew and Indian and Asia. So it's been simply opened up to precise the question of what is humanity, global humanity today, which is not only westernization, it's not the end of history, it's not the end of humanity as we know it, because technical research has taken over, but it's the beginning of the question, what is humanity? Now we are having to ask it seriously on ourselves, but the whole globe together. And so it's a different type of history, not one which writes the past, but one which is understood as a collective autobiography of humanity. So this book is more in the notion of thinking of ourselves as being part of the project and thinking reflexively about which kind of humanity and which kind of global structure are going to be. So it's normative only in the sense of reflection, not that we know what we are going to tell the world, but that we have to reflect upon how we are going to construct the world, all of us together. So yes, there are all these kind of crisscrossing points in the book, and of course it's a very complex book, and because it's obviously we think very differently, the both of us, from historians to theologians. Another theologian was to say something. Philip, please.
Yes. One of the tensions of the book is that this globalization thing is a longue durée stuff. It's starting with the axial age and all the rest of it. Now, that's fine. If we're talking about the Jesuit contribution to it, I think we have to reckon that the kind of collective social psychology of the Jesuit contribution was very different before the suppression and after the suppression, and that in many ways it's only at Vatican II that the society basically sort of paints the 19th century out of its collective past and sets up all sorts of mythological connections between what they're living now and what was going on in the old society.
Right.
If we're trying to think about what is the society doing in contemporary Africa, we have to recognize that the origins of the society's presence there is to do with 19th century colonization and very little to do with Ricci.
But again, this is what the paper by John McCready is
Yeah,
in the 19th century, because after the Restoration, the global mission of the Jesuits is to Romanize.
Yeah.
They simply have taken over the propaganda fide. They are now really the tools of propaganda fide in a way in which they were not before.
Right.
So this is the part of the interesting.
But in some ways, if we're going to talk about Jesuits and globalization, we need to be very clear how we're going to handle that doubleness. And once we start trying to build anything on the different essays, this becomes quite difficult.
Another thing about the suppression, 1773. I think that, and I try to say that, I don't know if it's so clear, that anti-Jesuitism is much more important as building of stereotypes, and not only stereotypes, in 17th century, and then until the rights controversy. Then there are materials that are used again, but there are all the same materials. At the end of the 18th century, also the Illuminism doesn't build nothing new. Just takes something from texts that are published again and again during the
Is there a question here?
If there's still time, I mean, and if it is possible also for, for the methodical aid, not completely alien from the project, but I was very interested by the comment that Professor Rapp made about attention to culture, and today you have a point of this kind of, how can I say, evangelicals that don't pay any attention to culture and still that kind of message stick. So I wonder if perhaps it's because they are capturing in their own way a kind of spirit of the time. And this kind of spirit of the time is about somehow alienation from the embedment into cultures. And especially the spirit of the time seems to be a message that is easily transmitted, that is like transmitted in pills. And I am not theologian myself, but I mean, it seems to me from, what I can call, not even my theological background, but at least, the kind of body of theological text that I still feel a great affection for, that this is a major challenge for the transmission of the Christian word itself. So I would like to know, being quite ignorant, I'm afraid to say, about the Jesuits, how can I say, missionary style at the moment. Whether this is a question that the order is asking, and what are the strategies, and how it is theorized, and how is the response. Because, I mean, this kind of, how can I say, commodification of the Christian message, that becomes something in between a therapy, and some kind of, anesthetic for social anxiety, is a major challenge, I would say, for Christianity itself. Thank you.
I mean, obviously, Professor Roy is the author of this very important book, Holy Ignorance, precisely about how religion can go today without culture. The then to the bit of culture. I mean, I was privileged to discuss this book with him in Washington. And of course, the extent to which Islam today, this notion of people trying to purify Islam from culture and just make it pure religion and not culture. This question you are raising are fundamental questions, theological questions, in Asia, have been raised. I mean, Dominus Jesu was an encyclical written precisely against Asian theologies that challenge the very notion of conversion, right? To accompany. So it's a debate going on within the church, but it has not been resolved. Dominus Jesu tried to put an end to this debate. And there are 3 articles in the first section of the book, which are 3 Jesuit theologians. Although one historian, but for example, the historian Utzerler plays theology there, probably is more theological than he feels comfortable with. And the other 2 are really, so there is a very interesting theological debate between 3 people dealing with the dialogue in Japan and China, Islam, which is the most complex of them all, and then India, which is very complex today as well. And one from a comparative theology perspective, the other from the perspective of dialogue with Islam, the other from the perspective of cultural interchange, not theological. And so these arguments are precisely there in the book. So in this sense, the introduction perhaps and the project as a whole may have a kind of a hidden agenda, but this will come later when I write the book myself. But the argument is to make how complex and to let all these arguments be there exposed in the book, and this very different perspective is there. Of course, there has to be a coherent project somehow. We'll try tomorrow how we can put it together. But I think that what is interesting about the book, precisely from very different perspectives, you could raise these kind of issues. And this is the crucial issue today, precisely how to become a Catholic Church global. And obviously, there has been a big debate since then, since Nostra Aetate, and then through Wojtyla and Ratzinger, and now again. So those things have been reopened again, and I assume that our book will play a role in reopening this debate.
It seems to me that the dynamic between religion and culture is two-way. It goes both ways. Even the evangelicals in Latin America who are becoming so successful there, even if they say they are not paying attention to culture, in fact, as you point out, they are in some ways responding to an actual cultural need. But they're responding to it in a way that is not culturally explicit. And I think the same would be true about your question about the Jesuits. Are they actors, or are they being acted upon in this whole? Are they players, or are they being played? I think was the language you used. It's both. It's both. And then it becomes a very complicated question about how to make any conclusions about what's really going on here. I mean, you have to make some sort of a stand about what's causing what in order to get an interpretive perspective, it seems to me. But that's, it's clearly working both ways.
And I'm looking forward to reading your history of El Chaco, the Historia Natural del Chaco, because this is the interesting thing about those Jesuits that were thrown out of Latin America because they were not loyal to the kingdoms, and as they come and found refuge in the Papal States, all of them begin to write histories of their countries, which are going to be a central source for Latin American nationalism. So these are the paradoxes of history, and this is part of the thing, how they are expelled from their countries. They come here as refugees, they become patriots, Latin Americans here when they are refugees. They write then histories of the nation, of Colombia, of Ecuador, and to a certain extent it is these local histories that the Jesuits write that then become the text with otherwise how can we explain so many different nations out of the Spanish colonies? There was no nationalism there before, and part of it is built by these histories written precisely, not only by them, they're not the only ones, but they're an important point in creating these local, national, cultural histories from the exile, from the Papal States here. So these are the paradoxes of history we also want, but when you get at the global level, these paradoxes are even more interesting, because really things that... But Father O'Malley, you should at least...
Say something?
Yes. About all these debates.
I've already done that, so... Well, one thing that strikes me is I really feel that this shift in Catholicism from a more prophetic stance to a dialogical stance is immense. It's immense, and we don't know where that's going to take us. And we're talking here now about the Jesuits and enculturation, dialogue with culture and so forth, as kind of an early dialogical religion, and that's not the tradition of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. It's much more profound, much more. Here's the truth. Take it or leave it. So that's what we do.
There is to accompany, not to convert, but to accompany. This is the word, right?
But to get to this point that Olivier raised as well about conversion, I mean, you had dialogue with the overt attempt to convert in that first phase. Since Vatican II, you've got dialogue. We don't use the word, or the Church, certainly the Jesuit order doesn't talk a lot about conversion these days, right? Is that a dramatic difference?
That carries the dialogical thing to its own conclusion.
But that's why Dominus Jesu came as a response. And he's not resolved this issue theologically within the Catholic Church at all. It will probably not be resolved within humanity. What does it mean, humanity? Do we have only one metaphysics, which is the one which comes out of the Greco-Roman world and the Hebrew Bible, and that get into our conception of science, and today our conception of the person? Or do we enter into serious dialogue? I mean, once China and India begin to play global roles, really, are they going to take our metaphysics, or are they going to try to bring their own metaphysics into the global projects? I mean, it's not clear at all.
You get Clooney talking about Jesuits back in India resisting transmigration of the and Karl Rahner, in the essay that I quoted, which is about what he calls European theology, which is what he's really saying is European theology is coming to an end. He explicitly says this must be taken seriously. And so where does that leave us with regard to what Clooney said about what happened back in the 16th and 17th century? It's a very interesting challenge.
I'm going to take the prerogative as chair to transition us from this rather formal and engaging setting to more informal reception that Alan and his colleagues have prepared for us. I do think this has been very useful. Edited volumes are difficult in general. This one is very ambitious, and we're trying to pull together a lot of different themes in a coherent fashion. And we've got our work cut out for ourselves. We'll be working on this tomorrow all day, and we'll know in a couple of days whether we've resolved a lot of the issues you've raised for us. I'm optimistic, cautiously optimistic. So thanks for coming. Please join me in thanking the panel.